Hello, this is the San Miguel Resource Center presentation on domestic violence. Our hope is that we'll be able to present key concepts and information that will help you better understand the complex dynamics of domestic violence and help survivors. This is our agenda for the domestic violence presentation. We'll also go over most of these topics in class, along with interactive exercises to help us better understand this topic. Now, the first point we want to illustrate about domestic violence is the different roles that advocates play versus people in the criminal justice system. Now, all of you are being trained to become domestic violence and sexual assault advocates. That means that your primary goal and your primary job responsibility is to provide emotional support, help, and really a safe place for people to go. The criminal justice system, on the other hand, is only going to become involved when a crime has been committed, and they're going to be focused on solving that crime and prosecuting that crime. As advocates, our primary role is to believe people when they self-identify as a victim. Now, law enforcement or the court system, such as the district attorney or the judges, can become frustrated or impatient when a victim is not ready to leave an abusive situation. Our role, on the other hand, is not to tell somebody if or when they should leave, but to support them where they are at. And that might involve safety planning, helping to educate them about the dynamics of domestic violence, but most importantly, being there as a source of support and as a source of somebody who just simply believes them and is ready to help them whenever they want to be helped. As advocates, one of the most important things we can do is to help people come up with options. And so when it would be dangerous, emotionally devastating, or simply embarrassing to involve law enforcement, we're going to always try to help people come up with different options. One of those options might be involving the criminal justice system, making a police report, talking to the district attorney, but we're also going to explore other options, whether that be safe housing or counseling or any number of other things. We're going to help people think those through. The criminal justice system, on the other hand, law enforcement, the district attorney, are really going to be focused on making a report, determining if a crime has been committed, collecting that evidence, and then prosecuting that crime. So in the next few slides, we're going to talk about different concepts that have been used throughout the years to understand or explain why domestic violence happens. So many years ago, it was said that domestic violence was caused by individual pathology. This is how advocacy centers like us or the criminal justice system would explain why domestic violence happens. And it still happens in a lot of places in our country as well as around the world, that more patriarchal beliefs or general acceptance of men abusing women is accepted and even encouraged in some sense. But in our country, as I said, with advocacy centers and criminal justice systems, we only really recognized extreme battering as a problem, so the really violent behavior. And the way that we attended to that, the way we treated that, was with medication and individual therapy for that extreme batter. It wasn't seen as a systemic problem or an intergenerational problem. It was really just seen as something that was wrong with that one person. So years later, it was believed that domestic violence was a relationship dysfunction, and it really placed the responsibility for the violence equally on both partners. So the thought was that either partner could stop or start the violence so that both partners were responsible. Now, with this equal placing of responsibility, the response by the criminal justice system and by advocacy centers was to recommend marital therapy. And this wasn't effective because it didn't address underlying issues that one or both partner might have about power and control, about their maybe sense of being entitled to have power and control over their partner. So the next evolution in thought was the cycle of violence, and we actually still use this model in a more modified form in the advocacy that we do today. Basically, the cycle of violence, which you'll see an illustration of on the next slide, theorizes that in every relationship where there is domestic violence, there's a honeymoon period, a tension building phase, and then an explosion. And over time, that cycle gets worse and worse. So if in the first explosion there was yelling and cussing, in the second explosion there might be a slap on the face. And then on the next cycle it gets worse. Part of the reason that this is only partially backed by research is because in abusive relationships, it doesn't always get worse. Some abusive relationships end at the yelling. Some of them do escalate each time, but it's not necessarily a perfect way to describe how domestic violence happens. One thing that we do use a lot with our clients when we talk about this is just helping them to identify when a honeymoon phase is happening, when tension building is happening, and when an explosion can be expected. Most people who are in domestic violence situations can really identify with this cycle, and it helps them to have a greater sense of control and understanding when they can identify what part of the cycle that they're in. Now, this is the illustration of the cycle of violence with the honeymoon phase, the tension building phase, and the explosion or battering phase. The idea behind this is that domestic violence is often cyclical and a slow progression. So on the previous slide, you saw the analogy of the frog being dropped into boiling water. And so that story is basically that if you drop a frog into boiling water, it'll jump right out. But if you put a frog into lukewarm room temperature water and slowly turn up the heat, it will boil to death. And that's similar to somebody entering into an abusive relationship. At the beginning of almost every relationship, it is wonderful. Everybody's in love, you can do no wrong, but slowly and progressively over time, a relationship becomes violent. And again, the idea with this is that it becomes progressively more and more violent. And as I mentioned before, that doesn't always happen. Certain relationships don't keep progressing, but it doesn't mean that they're not violent. And the other way around is also true, that in healthy relationships, we also go through these cycles of the honeymoon phase and tension building and explosions, and it doesn't necessarily make it abusive unless somebody feels as though they're being abused, unless someone feels like their power and control is consistently being stripped away from them in some sense. So the current conceptual model that we use to understand domestic violence is the power and control wheel. And basically what this theory entails is saying that an abusive person in a relationship has a belief or a need that tells them they have the right to have power and control over their partner. And responding to this, whether it's through advocacy or the criminal justice system, the response is really to make perpetrators, people who are convicted of domestic violence, attend classes to basically challenge this belief system and ultimately alter it so that they don't feel that they have the right or that they're entitled to have power and control over another person. So the power and control wheel is basically saying that domestic violence isn't necessarily about physical violence, but about having power and control over another person, over your intimate partner. And when somebody is abusive and they believe, whether it's conscious or not, that they can and should have power and control over their partner, there's a number of different things that they might use to accomplish that. I've never sat down with somebody who's self-identifies as a victim of domestic violence and had them look at this chart and say that their partner only uses one of these things. So for example, if I were to sit down with somebody who is a victim of domestic violence, they might say that there is emotional abuse, that there's name calling, that there's intimidation, that their partner uses the children to manipulate the situation or threatens them in certain ways. One problem that I have, and I think that the Resource Center really has with this model, is just that using male privilege is one of the pieces of this pie, because women also commit domestic violence, whether they are partners with another woman or with a man. It is important to acknowledge that men are also victims and that women are very much capable of committing domestic violence. It's also really important to understand that each of these things are acts of domestic violence. So they might not leave bruises or scarring, they might not result in broken furniture, but they very much are things that can scare people and can make them feel like their personal power and control has been taken away. So if you were to speak to somebody who either self-identified as a perpetrator of domestic violence or was identified by the criminal justice system and ask them why they committed domestic violence, in my experience, it's very unlikely that they will tell you that the reason they did what they did was to have power and control over their intimate partner. On the other hand, if you were to speak to somebody who was a victim of domestic violence, it's very easy for them to identify that while the domestic violence was happening, that they felt as if their power and control was being taken away from them. Now, this is one definition of domestic violence that you can see here. I would add to it that when domestic violence is an issue is when these types of abusive behaviors become a pattern. When something happens once or twice, couples are often able to work through it or move past it. However, when these issues become cyclical, if you think back to the cycle of violence, or become a pattern that is used to take away that power and control from one partner to another, that is when people will feel as though they are in an abusive relationship. So when you're acting as an advocate for the San Miguel Resource Center, it's very important that you understand clearly that the San Miguel Resource Center does not recommend couples counseling when there has been recent physical violence. If you consider our main conceptual model, which is the power and control wheel, we understand that the reason that people are abusive is to have power and control over their intimate partner, that they feel entitled to that power and control. So when a couple goes into couples counseling, into marital therapy, oftentimes what happens is that perpetrator's sense of power and control is taken away. A counselor will encourage open, honest discussion. And in that open, honest discussion, it is often the counselor in some way that has control over the situation and not the perpetrator. So once that couple leaves couples counseling, that perpetrator will need to find a way to regain that power and control. And if violence is currently present in the relationship, you run a great risk that violence will be used to get that power and control back. And so if you're ever working with a client who asked for couples counseling or a referral to a couples counselor, it's really important that you, instead of offering couples counseling referrals, encourage individual counseling and therapy for both them and their partner. And it needs to be done in a way that physical violence becomes something that is much further back in the past and not a present threat to their physical safety. As advocates for the San Miguel Resource Center, it's really important to understand that it is a myth that domestic violence is caused by any of these things. When we talk about cause, we have to differentiate between cause and correlation. So if we're talking about something causing domestic violence, alcohol, for example, is probably the most common one. If alcohol were to cause domestic violence, everyone who drank alcohol would become violent. We would still be living in the time of prohibition. If we were to say that everyone who was bipolar, for example, or a narcissist, for example, was abusive, then everyone who had that mental illness would be abusive. And that's just not the case. And so it's really important that we don't try to make sweeping generalizations about why a person or even a group of people are violent. There are correlations. I will be the first to tell you that, and I think any law enforcement officer would tell you there's an incredibly strong correlation, especially between alcohol and domestic violence. But these things do not actually cause domestic violence. And again, we always want to get back to that underlying belief system, whether it's conscious or unconscious, that a person who is perpetrating domestic violence has, that they are entitled to or for some reason have the right to have power and control over another person. We're going to talk about do's and don'ts of how to talk with somebody who has been a victim of domestic violence. On this slide, you'll see a list of don'ts, and each of them is very important. Never say to someone, just leave. That's very much simplifying their life and their relationship, and it also could be putting them in a whole lot of danger. If you think about the power and control wheel and a perpetrator's need to maintain that power and control, if someone is to just leave, they're essentially taking all of that power and control away from the perpetrator. In some cases, that is the safest thing, and that can work great. In other cases, that can put the victim in a whole lot more danger. So our job is really to think through their options with them and help them make their own best decision. Don't encourage couples counseling or other work it out strategies. Again, we don't want to oversimplify by saying things like, well, if you could just talk to him, if you could just convince him that, if you could just tell her that she needs to, we don't want to oversimplify or tell them something that more than likely won't be effective. Never blame the victim for staying, for provoking, or for going back on something they may have told law enforcement. And definitely don't ever criticize the perpetrator. It might feel like the right thing to do in the moment, especially if the victim is calling their perpetrator names, to be on board with them, to take their side and to use those names too. But chances are that they'll feel embarrassed to call the resource center a second time if they know that you or someone else there thinks poorly of their perpetrator and is maybe judging them for having gone back to them, which in most cases people do in that honeymoon phase. Do present options. Help them think of all of the resources they have available to them. Whether that is a financial resource, whether that's safe housing, counseling, friends and family that they might turn to, really help them explore all of the options that they have. Focus on safety. everything from emotional safety, verbal safety, safety for their children, to the physical safety and sexual safety that they might be feeling as threatened at that time. Really try to understand where the client is coming from. Use your empathic skills to talk with them about how they're feeling, what obstacles they face, so that you can really understand what being in this situation feels like for them. Educate them. Talk to them about the cycle of violence. Talk to them about the power and control wheel so that they can start to identify what is not working in their current situation. A lot of times people know that it just doesn't feel right, it doesn't feel good, or that it feels scary and dangerous. Help them develop the vocabulary to identify why. Be non-judgmental. Again, don't simplify what they're going through or what their next steps will be and how that will impact their life. Really do your best to be non-judgmental about why they're in the situation they're in, how they got into it, how they're gonna get out, and ask questions. Ask open-ended questions that will help you better understand where they're coming from. In the process of asking those questions and exploring those options, being non-judgmental, it will help the client also get a better sense of where they're coming from for themselves. It'll help them better understand how they got there and how they want to make a change in their life. When a person is getting ready to leave an abusive relationship, whether there has been physical safety or not, you always want to help assess their safety. And really the best indicator of their safety is that person's opinion. They'll have a pretty good read and a pretty good guess as to how their perpetrator will react by them leaving or them getting ready to leave. So you want to ask them, are you safe? Do you feel safe? What do you think is going to happen? Are you worried about the safety of your kids? Is it okay to call you at this phone number, or does your perpetrator monitor your phone? On the more serious side of things, you want to find out if there's guns in the house, if there's been any threats that their perpetrator may use guns or any other lethal means. Sometimes perpetrators' most lethal threat is that they're going to harm themselves and not their victim. And a lot of times this will keep victims sort of frozen because they're afraid to be responsible for someone inflicting a serious injury or death upon themselves. And you want to talk about what the safest room in the house is. The least safe room in the house is usually the kitchen. Hot things, sharp things. It's a room that if a victim knows a tension building is happening and an explosion might take place, you want to encourage them to move to a different space. So really trying to assess if they feel safe and if they feel safe for their kids is very important. In safety planning, it's really important for you as the advocate to express your concerns and to educate. So help people understand why leaving can be a dangerous time. Talk about the power and control wheel. Talk about the cycle of violence. And with that, you will have a pretty good indication of what to expect because of what past behavior has included. So for example, if physical violence is part of their cycle, you might want to work with that person to address that safety concern, because if that perpetrator feels as though they've lost power and control, which they do when somebody has left, you want to be aware of what physical safety concerns may exist. And really feel free to speak from your heart to talk to them about how you feel concerned for them and their kids. A lot of times people need to hear this. They need to hear that somebody is looking in from the outside and can see that there's legitimate reason to be afraid and to really think things through in the safest and smartest way. So one of the things that you can always do when a person is getting ready to leave is to ask for a civil standby from law enforcement. A civil standby is basically when we ask law enforcement to be present while somebody is leaving their property, their house, their apartment, and we want them to be there so that violence does not occur. So this is different than reporting a crime, reporting that abuse has occurred or is occurring in that moment. We're not reporting anything. We're just asking law enforcement to be present so that no violence can occur as that person is trying to leave. And so law enforcement is willing to do this. They can show up at a person's house or apartment, and they'll be present for 15 to 30 minutes as they're getting their belongings, the most important essentials like documentation, birth certificates, maybe medication, sentimental belongings that they can't live without. They're not going to stay there while somebody spends hours and hours moving out of a home. They really are just there in that small window of time to make sure that they can leave safely. Now, it's important to understand that you can do safety planning with anyone who's concerned about their safety, from very, very basic safety planning that might be more emotional to very involved safety planning that might involve leaving the home or even leaving the state or the country. We've worked with people on all of these levels, and there's a really wide spectrum. And again, it does come back to talking with people about options and exploring what option feels the best and the safest for them. Now, if the victim isn't ready to leave, but they think or they know that they're headed in that direction, this is a list of things that you can discuss with them to help keep them moving in that direction and help them maintain their own safety. Gathering evidence, setting money aside, even if it's just a couple dollars a week, every little bit helps. Documenting injuries and having a safe place to keep that documentation where the perpetrator won't find it. Knowing where weapons are kept in the house and steering clear of those areas when they can feel that tension is building. Having a friend that they are in touch with very regularly to let them know that they are safe, that they are not harmed, and that their kids are also safe. And then plans related to violence for themselves and the kids in relation to their living situation or places that they are frequently, whether that's a place of business, where mom or dad works, letting them know what the safest rooms are, who the neighbors are, how to dial 911. Those are all things that are important to discuss in terms of safety planning, even when somebody is not ready to leave. So this is just a review for when you're working with somebody who is preparing to leave a abusive situation. Again, remember that it can be a very dangerous time. Think about the power and control wheel and the cycle of violence, and talk with them, educate them about these issues, and assess their safety. Work with them around options. Encourage them to gather important belongings. A lot of times when people are right in the middle of a traumatic situation, it's hard to think clearly. So help them think clearly. Help them think through the things that they need or their children need that are essentials. Talk with them about where they're going to go, short term and long term. These are things that they want to start thinking about and that can help them continue to move in the right place without feeling like they're stuck in their abusive situation. And don't ever hesitate to ask for a civil standby or talk with people about a civil standby as an option for when they're getting ready to leave. So after the victim or the offender leaves, there's a number of things that we can do and we can work with them on to help keep them safe. This is just a short list of them right here, and for each individual situation, there's going to be unique circumstances that can be added to this list as well. But when applicable, we can help people change their locks, change their phone number, or work to screen calls or block their number. We always want to encourage people, if there is an order of protection, which was formerly called a restraining order, we always want to encourage people to keep a copy of that on them if one exists, and to call law enforcement to enforce it when they know or they think it may have been violated. We want to have them try to keep their new address a secret. It's hard in the small towns that we all live in, but this can help, especially in the immediate aftermath of when somebody has left. And then to have people in their life who care about them know where they are at all times. We also want to make sure child care providers have the necessary legal documentation that let them know who can pick up the children. And this is something that a child care provider will have to have documented from the court. It can't just be something that one party says to the child care provider. So we always want to make sure that that important documentation is being passed along. So we always want a safety plan in context and understand that there's certain aspects of people's cultures that might not support someone leaving even when it is a highly abusive situation. One example I have is a Hispanic woman that I worked with for years and years. She was trying to leave her abusive husband. And finally she did. And about a month after, she came into my office and she was incredibly sad. And I asked her, why was she sad? Was it that she missed him? Because that was totally normal. And she shook her head and said, no, I'm glad I'm not with him. But now that I don't have a husband, other women in her culture or in her kind of social circle here in Telluride saw her as a threat and didn't want to be friends with her because she was a single woman. And so she felt as if she was facing a sort of ostracism from her social structure because she was single, even though most people knew she was leaving an abusive situation. And that was really hard for her to sort of feel as if she was wearing the scarlet letter. You also have to understand that a batterer can make it safer for people in some ways. Sometimes that's actual literal physical protection a batterer can provide, depending on if people live in a dangerous area. It can also have to do with finances. If the batterer is the primary breadwinner, then it can feel like the world is not as safe of a place if the victim now doesn't have a source of income to take care of themselves or their children. The San Miguel Resource Center can offer up to 3 nights of safe housing for people who are leaving an abusive relationship. Now, in the scheme of things, offering 3 nights is usually a very small amount of time. We'll talk about the location of our safe housing at the end of training. Once you've completed it, we'll give you that confidential information. But just know that an advocate will never do safe housing on their own. As with any complex situation, we always want to encourage our advocates to contact a staff person to ask for help, to ask for assistance in completing a safe housing or anything that feels like it might be over your head. I know a lot of times for advocates, that safe housing is a really intimidating topic to take on. And I just want to really reassure you that we're never going to put you in a situation where we're expecting you to do that all by yourself. You're always going to be working in conjunction with a staff person to help a victim get into a safe house. So when you have to safe house someone, this is essentially how it's going to work. And the most important thing I can say is that you're always going to be working with your staff backup every situation, every person is different. And so the needs of that safe housing situation are always going to be different too. So we're kind of constantly adjusting to what the needs of that particular client is. But these are the basics. You're going to work with a staff person to make sure that the safe housing unit is ready and available and prepared. You're going to arrange to meet that client, hopefully at the San Miguel Resource Center office, whether that's in Telluride, Nucla, or Norwood. You might have to talk with the client about arranging a civil standby and developing a safety plan with that client, what to bring, what to avoid, who to tell, who to not tell. You're going to meet with the staff and the client to fill out the safe housing packet. And that's basically a packet that we go through with a client that details essentially our rules for being in safe housing. And then you're going to work with a staff person to ensure that the client's basic needs are met for food, for clothing, for medication, and we're going to talk with them about follow-up, maybe getting them into safe housing that night and then meeting with a staff person again the next morning after they've been able to have a good, safe night's sleep. As I previously mentioned, offering 3 nights of safe housing is usually a very small amount of time to help somebody figure out how to completely restructure their life in terms of their housing. Sometimes we can accomplish that through different means. Sometimes we can figure out how to keep them in their home and have the perpetrator leave. Other times when people need more extended safe housing, we have to transport and refer them to a shelter nearby. It could be Montrose, Grand Junction, Durango, Delta, Cortez. There's a number of different places that we can help people get to where they can have a safe home for themselves or themselves and their children for an extended period of time to help them get back on their feet and get some of the logistics in their life reorganized and taken care of. So we find that most people who go through our advocate training use this information more in their own lives than they actually do as advocates on our hotline. And it's good to take that information and help it empower you to maybe better your own relationships, understand your past relationships, help you heal, help a friend or a relative, challenge myths and stereotypes, or in your work as an advocate. I do want to really encourage you that if you ever have a friend or a family member who is in a violent situation, to clarify what your role is. And so if it's somebody that you have a personal relationship with already, ethically, as advocates, we need to just be there for them as friends. And if you want someone to work with them as an advocate, please refer them to working with somebody else through the San Miguel Resource Center or through an advocacy service where they live. But it's important that you really clarify that you're their friend or you're their sister or brother and not that you're their advocate, because having those relationships can get really confusing both for you and for them. We hope that you'll use this information as an advocate, and we really encourage you to continue building upon this information, both through the advocate training as well as on your own. Of everything that you've learned in advocate training and will learn in advocate training, it's really important to remember that the best thing that you can do for somebody who calls is to be there for them and to believe them. Just answering the phone is a huge step. Just being a listening ear is really the most important thing for somebody who is calling as a victim. They just want to be heard and believed. And always remember, too, that staff is available 24 hours a day. We always have staff backup, so you're never alone. Even if you're sitting there talking to a victim by yourself, you always have staff support available to you no matter what. And I want you to remember what is normal. In the face of trauma, whether it is a person who's calling you, who's just experienced trauma, or your secondary trauma from hearing about their traumatic experience, people have a wide variety of reactions to trauma. And so be open-minded, be non-judgmental of both our callers and yourself if there's something that is triggering for you in the way that they present their information or in the actual information itself. You already have what it takes to be an advocate just by being here, just by being willing to learn and by being willing to understand these complex dynamics of domestic violence. The rest of the details will get filled in as we go along. And again, staff is always there to help you, whether it is with a complicated caller that you might talk with on the hotline, or by how you are personally affected by the material in this course or by a call that you might get. Thank you so much for being willing to go through this presentation with me, and please feel free to follow up with any questions that you might have.